Welcome to episode 23 of the 3am Fear podcast. As you approach the Minnie Winston house, the air around you seems to grow thick with an ominous energy. The once beautiful white walls are now marred by the deep crimson stains that seem to pulse with a life of their own. The broken windows and the creaky doors of the abandoned house only add to the feeling of unease that creeps up your spine. It's said that strange things happen in the house, things that cannot be explained by rational means. Whispers of ghostly apparitions and otherworldly activity swirl around the house, instilling a sense of terror in the bravest of souls. The Minnie Winston house stands as a haunting reminder of the unknown, a place where the veil between this world and the next may be thinner than we realize. As you take your first tentative steps towards the door, you can't help but wonder what kind of horrors might be waiting for you inside the bleeding house. Hello and welcome to the 3am Fear podcast. I'm Nikita Ferrao, mystery and thriller author. On this podcast, I talk about real crimes and real people. Due to the graphic nature of some of this content, listener discretion is advised. You can find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. Let's get started. The Minnie Winston house is a landmark in American history known for its mysterious and unexplained occurrences of bloodstains and other bizarre incidents. The house, located in rural Kentucky, has been the subject of much speculation for many years. Despite extensive investigations by law enforcement and other paranormal investigators, the source of the bloodstains and other strange events remains unknown to this day. Minnie Winston, a local woman, bought the house in the late 1920s. At first, everything seemed normal. However, it wasn't long before strange things began to occur. The first signs of trouble were the unexplained bloodstains that began appearing on the walls, floors, and ceilings of the house. Despite the best efforts of Minnie and her husband to clean the house, the bloodstains just kept reappearing. It was a late Tuesday night on September 8, 1987. At 1114 Fountain Drive, Atlanta, Georgia, a small brick house sat on a bank just off the main road in a quiet neighborhood. This 3-bedroom house with a kitchen and a living room was just like any other house on the street. In this home lived an older couple, William and Minnie Clyde Winston. They had lived there for over 2 decades. William was 79 years old and Minnie was 77. Over their years together, William and Minnie had raised 3 children, but by 1987, their children, who were now adults, had grown up and moved out of their parents' home. Although Minnie lived with her husband, she at times felt lonely because William struggled with health issues and his kidneys were slowly failing. Most of Minnie's days would go by looking after William and taking care of the house. When her last child had finally moved out, she found the house quiet and lonely. It was the night of September 8, 1987. Minnie had finished helping William and let him rest. She decided she was done for the night and wanted to unwind and relax. Looking after her loving husband could be tiring, and all Minnie wanted to do right now was get into the bathtub and have a few moments to herself. She locked the door, activated the alarm system, and made sure her husband was tucked into his bed, and then proceeded to draw herself a bath. She rested a towel behind her head, closed her eyes, and relaxed in the warm, soothing water. By the time she was done with her bath, she was relaxed and happy. She slowly stepped out of the shower, only to find something that horrified her. On the bathroom floor, she noticed that underneath her foot was a pool of something dark and red. It didn't seem like water. It was thick. It was more of a wine color. She wasn't drinking that night, so it couldn't have been wine. It had to be something else. She tried to look everywhere to see where this liquid was coming from, but it just seemed to be there, on the floor, all over. Although it was as red as blood, blood was not what came to her mind right away. As she stood there for a few minutes, she felt the liquid pressing against her feet. She could smell it, bubbling up from the tile floor. It smelled like iron, the smell of blood. Minnie immediately looked up at the ceiling to see if blood was coming from the attic. But the ceiling was completely white. The second she realized that the blood was not pouring from top, the next thought that came to her mind was her husband, Willie. She was afraid that Willie might have hurt himself and that this was his blood. She knew his health was poor, so it very well could have been him. She quickly pulled herself together and raced out to her husband's bedroom. But what she saw outside terrified her. As she swung open the bathroom door, she saw the entire hallway covered in blood. This was along with the baseboards, and the blood was pouring down her white walls, droplets the size of a silver dollar. She stepped a little closer to see if someone had been shot, the result of which was the splatter. But it just didn't make any sense. She was still afraid that her husband was hurt, and so she raced towards his bedroom. Every second that she ran towards the bedroom felt like a million years. Minnie later in an interview described it like a sprinkler just spraying blood out of the wall. With dread and confusion, she opened her husband's bedroom door. She was surprised and equally relieved to see him sleeping peacefully. But this didn't answer her question. Where was all this blood coming from? She shook her husband, asking him to wake up and see what was happening in their house. Willie was half asleep, dazed, and couldn't understand what his wife was asking him. He was surprised when she asked him to get out of bed. She kept on asking him to get up and come with her to see what was going on. It took Willie some time to get himself up and out of bed, as he was too sick to do it himself. By the time the couple reached the hallway, the red liquid was oozing down from the walls, the floor, everywhere. The living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, they were all filled with blood. Take some time and imagine how this old couple must have felt. It was late at night. They were all alone in this house, and there was blood coming from everywhere. I mean, almost everywhere that they could imagine. Willie and Minnie did the exact same thing that any sane person would do. They called the cops. Minnie knew that Willie was not hurt, but she was equally afraid that someone might have been hurt and this person was in the house. She wanted to help this person. When the call went to the police, by then there were a lot of murder cases happening around. And so when the call came, they immediately dispatched their crew to go and check out the house. When the EMTs arrived, they did not find a body, but there was blood everywhere. There was no single source that they could find and say, this is where the blood is coming from. Willie told them that he wasn't bleeding, and there was no scratches on either his or Minnie's body. Everyone was puzzled and shocked at whatever was happening in the house. The blood was coming from somewhere, and it had to belong to someone. So the first thing that the police had to do was find out whether this blood belonged to a human being or an animal. The blood was sent in for testing, and a few days later, they found out that not only was this human blood, but this blood did not belong to Willie or Minnie. The blood that was found in their house was type O, while the Winston's blood type was A. Before they tracked the blood, they thought that maybe Willie's dialysis equipment was malfunctioning and that's why there was blood everywhere. But after the blood report, they realized that this was not Willie's blood. Nobody else was reportedly seen in the house, and there didn't seem to be any form of crime that occurred in the house, except for the blood, of course. There was no weapon, nobody, nothing. And even with the blood, they were unable to track this to who the person was that this blood belonged to. The police were stumped. Now blood oozing out of the walls of a house, on the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. This of course had to catch the attention of the media. And it did. This news literally made the local newspaper, which is crazy to think. I mean, isn't the whole story scary? Detective Steve Cartwright was on this case. When the police interviewed the Winstons, they said that they had locked their doors and set the alarm at 9:30 p.m. that night. The house was perfectly clean. There were no animals, no rats, no roaches, nothing. There was nothing out of the ordinary that night in the house. Minnie had carefully tucked her husband into bed, gotten into the shower, and when she got out, she saw this blood. During the time between her getting into the shower and out of the shower, neither she nor Willie heard any footsteps or anyone getting into the house. There didn't seem to be any possibility of a break-in, and the alarm also didn't go off, which means neither the family members nor any outsider had ever entered the house. Initially, the police were interested in the case because a lot of murders and break-ins were happening around the city. And because there was so much blood, they thought that maybe someone was murdered in this house, and all they had to do was find the body and they could find the killer. But as time passed, it seemed like the case was getting more and more mysterious. The police were still trying to figure out where this blood was coming from. And there was, of course, this one thing that crossed their mind. That maybe all of this was a hoax. That this couple actually put together an elaborate plan, put up this whole blood scenario, and that's why when the police came in, they could not find any information. That's because no one actually broke into the house. But somehow, all of this blood appeared, and so maybe the couple were behind it. Whatever was happening in this house was attracting a lot of media attention. And before Minnie knew it, she was getting calls. Non-stop calls on her landline from journalists who wanted to come and see the house. Some of these calls were prank calls, just to trouble the couple. Video journalists would come in and record specks of blood on the walls and the pools that had now formed on the floors. Despite what anyone believed, Minnie kept telling everyone, including the journalists, that she had no idea where this blood was coming from. And by now she was tired of all these questions that people were asking her. She got frustrated to the extent that she said, quote, "I still don't know where the blood is coming from, and I'm tired of all these people asking me all these questions. If anybody comes here today, I am not going to open the door." End quote. Everyone was obsessed with this house, so I don't blame her for being tired and frustrated. She was an old woman in need of some peace, quiet, and answers. As days passed, no questions were answered. On September 12, 1987, the local police admitted that there were no leads, and if they couldn't find any evidence of crime that had been committed in the house, they would close the investigation. Blood specialists had also been called to the scene, but they said that even though there was a lot of blood, they didn't think that a murder had been committed in the house. The amount of blood found in that house was enough for one person to be drained completely of blood. There were also some crazy enthusiasts in the neighborhood who wanted to come and see this house, even though Minnie and Willie had clearly said that they did not want anyone troubling them. But these people kept showing up at the house. It got to the point where the Winstons began shouting out of the windows, telling everyone that there was no more blood, that the house had just stopped oozing blood. I'm assuming Minnie thought that this was a good idea and that if people thought that there was no more blood, they would just stop turning up. But unfortunately, this turned out to be a wrong move from her end, because there were more people now than ever here at her house trying to figure out what was happening and where this blood was coming from. The police too didn't believe that any murder had taken place in the house. So on October 24th, one of the officers said that they stopped the investigation because there was nothing new that they knew about the house. They said that a house did not randomly bleed blood. There had to be a story behind it, but they just couldn't figure it out. Police spokeswoman Marion Lee said officers weren't assuming it was a hoax. She said, quote, "I'm sure they, detectives, would still be investigating it if they believed that was the case." End quote. The Winstons were completely frustrated. The police weren't doing anything, the reporters were harassing them, their neighbors were harassing them. They just wanted everything to stop. After several months of checking, tracking, trying to figure out what was happening, the police finally gave up. Since they could not determine that a crime had occurred in the house, they said that without a crime, no one could be punished. Detective Cartwright said in an interview, quote, "It's an extremely strange situation. I've been on the force 10 years and I've never seen anything like this." End quote. Even though the police put an end to this investigation, people couldn't help but come up with their own theories of what may have happened. This unsolved mystery had been grained into the minds of several people. Even after several years, people still talk about what happened in that house. But there are two main theories that always come up. The first popular theory is that all of this is a hoax, that someone had been running around the house spraying blood, trying to trick this poor old couple into thinking that there was blood coming from the walls. So now the main question was, who in the family or who around them had access to so much blood? I mean, you can't just walk into a blood bank and say, "Give me so much blood." As how the police described, the amount of blood that was found on the walls, on the floor, everywhere, it couldn't be that a person was just buying a bag of blood. It was a lot of blood. So who had access to so much blood? I tried to do a check on my own, but I couldn't find out whether this blood belonged to one person or multiple people. There is nothing written about this. The blood, of course, did not belong to the Winstons because it was completely different, which meant it did not belong to their children either. After further digging, it was found that the Winstons had certain family problems, and these problems existed far before the incident. So maybe there is a possibility that the couple were behind this, and they just wanted to get their children's attention. Maybe their children had moved out, they were all alone, and they wanted to get their children to come back. So if the Winstons did it, how did they manage this? Willie had to constantly go to the hospital, which meant that he could have the easiest access to blood. Some believe that Willie stole this blood and then used it to cover his house. Also, during the investigation, the police found out that one of their daughters worked as a nurse and had access to human blood. Their motive, you ask? It could be inheritance. The children could have used this to prove that their parents were incompetent and put them in a home. That way, they could get access to their parents' finances. So it is completely possible that on the night of September 8, the children snuck into their parents' home and covered the walls and the floors with blood. The other popular running theory is that the house is haunted and that this is the work of a supernatural entity. Now, if this was the work of something or someone supernatural, then it was an isolated incident, because no one else ever saw blood. But again, the house was built in the 1940s, and there were plenty of unreported things that could have happened throughout the decades leading up to the incident. During the course of the investigation, the authorities took a deeper look into the history of the house. The police found that the house previously belonged to Albert Thompson and his wife. Albert worked for the Federal Housing Authority, where he was tasked with monitoring fair prices around Atlanta. Albert was 41 when he was driving west at the intersection of Mitchell and Davis Street when a southbound truck rammed into his car. Albert was treated and sent to his house even though he was in a very critical condition with internal bleeding. The man responsible for Albert's injuries was not charged with anything and was let off with just a warning. Albert was an African American, while the man who caused the accident was a white male. The man was set free with a slap on the wrist, and Albert was left to suffer with his wounds. Some believe that the bleeding is connected to Albert, as the blood appeared when the anniversary of the car accident was close, on Halloween. Years later, even though there was once blood in the house, the Winstons continued to live there. They refused to admit the fact that there was a lot of blood, even though initially it was them who found the blood and called the cops. They would later say that maybe it was red dye that had leaked out of the rug, or maybe it was just contaminated water from rusty pipes. Whatever it was, they lived in that house and they chose to live in denial. No matter how many times, how many people told them to leave the house, they didn't. And this is the one question that has been unanswered to this day. Why would someone choose to live in a house that stands on the ground of an unsolved mystery? It was not that they chose to live there for a few days, few weeks, or few months. The Winstons lived there for 22 years. Willie Winston died 2 years after the night the walls of their home bled. Minnie, however, lived until the ripe old age of 104 years. She passed away in 2015. I was reading a few news clips from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and this particular one from 12 September 1987 got me a little intrigued. This paper is 4 days after the blood was found. Now, I have to say, when you read something from the media, the articles, or any sources online, especially when it's at the beginning stages of the investigation, just keep an open mind. I did so. New evidence comes up and we are introduced to new suspects, so opinions do change over time. This is an old case, and when I started reading this newspaper clipping, I went in with an open mind. Remember, at this point, everyone was thinking and making up different possibilities. Nothing was confirmed. The first paragraph reads, quote, "Police may have complicated the mystery of a blood-stained house by waiting more than 13 hours before calling in state crime lab experts who had only dried blood to examine." End quote. Now, if we go with this, I don't understand what the police were doing for 13 hours in that house without getting the blood tested. But once again, only if we go with this. I checked a few websites and came by this article in the crimemuseum.org website. I'll read out whatever they have said because I don't want to miss out on anything when paraphrasing. You can read the whole article on their website. I'll link it in the description. It reads, quote, "It is important to get the sample to the laboratory as quickly as possible because after 48 hours, the sample might be useless." End quote. This does show that the police did manage to send in the blood prior to 48 hours. But why wait 13 hours? That's 13 precious hours. They could have found so much more. In fact, State Crime Lab Director Larry Howard even said that a more complete analysis of the blood would have been possible if he had gotten wet blood samples instead of dried ones. He also added that tests of fresh blood can easily reveal the sex, race, and other aspects such as traces of drugs or alcohol. When he was asked what he thought could have caused the stains, he said, quote, "It looked like the blood was projected out of something or shaken off something." End quote. Could this have been someone with access to blood bags, pouring them on the floor and squirting them on the walls? According to the newspaper, Ted Staples, a state crime lab forensic serologist who examined the house at 1 p.m. on Wednesday said, quote, "Why it wasn't like that in this case, we don't know." End quote. I was initially questioning the state crime lab on why they weren't able to track down the person based on the blood tests, and some of these statements answered that. The blood just wasn't sent on time. The first wave of criminal cases involving DNA identification began in 1986, and the first person to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence was Robert Milias in 1987, the same year that the blood was found in Minnie Winston's house. I know it was the first time with DNA identification, but they could have at least tried tracing this blood. Or maybe they did and they couldn't because it was all new, it was the first time, so that's a possibility. At this point, anything could have been possible. When the police were questioned, they said that they delayed because they thought it was animal blood. It was after they sent the blood to Grady Memorial Hospital for testing and it came back positive that they found out it was human blood, and that's when they called in state crime lab experts. In the end, 1114 Fountain Drive, Atlanta, Georgia, still stands today, and whoever owns this bleeding house either believes it was all a hoax or just doesn't mind owning a cursed house. The bleeding house mystery remains an intriguing enigma that has puzzled investigators and captivated the public for years. Despite numerous investigations and scientific analysis, no definitive explanation has been found for the strange occurrences at the house. The case continues to spark speculation and interest among those fascinated by the paranormal and unexplained phenomena. Whether the house is haunted or not, the bleeding house mystery reminds us of the mysteries that exist in our world and the limits of our current understanding of the unknown. Perhaps one day, with advancements in technology and science, we may finally unravel the secrets of the bleeding house and many mysteries such as those. Until then, it remains a haunting and enduring mystery that continues to captivate our imagination. That's it for the day. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to follow me on social media, especially Instagram. The links are in my description box. You can also find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. If you love reading thrillers, you can now check out my free ebook available on my website. Once again, thank you so much for being here today and see you next week. Have a great week and stay safe out there.